Well, hopefully today will surpass yesterday, which was quite spectacular. But we have a lot to do in a short period of time this morning through lunch, so I want to get started. We have a wonderful panel to start us today. I've been studying philanthropy and going to conferences for about 13 years now. And we often hear from thought leaders and foundation presidents and donors, but seldom do you hear, or I've seldom heard, in fact, I've never really heard foundation trustees discuss some of the issues facing philanthropy today. So as we were designing this program, I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to try to do something a little bit different. What I know from the work at the center is that outside of the foundation world, most people don't really understand foundations other than as grant makers. And those inside the field will tell you how idiosyncratic foundations can be with the phrase, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And the people that are on the real outside of the foundation world are always sort of trying to ascribe motives and strategies when they see decisions from the outside with not much of a clue about what's really going on at the foundation and how the board's trying to direct the future of its work. I remember, it's been a while, but I got a call from a reporter talking about the new CEO at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and they asked, so what do you think they're really trying to do? And I go, that's a really good question. You ought to talk to some trustees. I have no clue what's going on in the boardroom. And so what we have for you today, this morning, is a panel of illustrious foundation trustees. And we're going to really talk about what goes on, what's on the minds of boards of directors of foundations in a variety of ways. Let me introduce our panelists. Monica Lozano, who's the CEO of Impri Media. Irene Hirano Inouye, who's the president of the U.S.-Japan Council. Kerry Sullivan, who's president and CEO of the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, and Robert Denham, who is a partner in Munger, Tolles, and Olson. So those are their day jobs, so to speak. What we know is that they all have served on corporate boards, nonprofit boards, but they all have also served on foundation boards. Monica is currently a trustee of the Weingart Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and previously served as a trustee of the California Healthcare Foundation. Irene is the chair of the Ford Foundation Board currently, as well as a trustee of the Kresge Foundation Board, and she previously served as chair of that board as well. Kerry is a president and CEO and trustee of the Bank of America Foundation Board. And Robert Denham has just completed 12 years as a board member at the MacArthur Foundation, the last 6 being as the board chair. He's also the chair currently of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Irvine Foundation. So you can see that they have a service on a wide range of foundation boards. We don't have every type of foundation represented. There are no community foundations up here, really, at least not that I know of, or family foundations. But we thought this was at least a beginning point to talk about foundation boards and what are their opportunities and challenges. And so with that, let me just start with the idea of talking about how do boards, what's the dynamics of boards, and how do you assess how boards actually perform as a board. Robert, you want to start with that?
Okay. I think the questions about how boards work together, how they can be most effective. And boards, I think, have to create a sense of teamwork. And one of the bases for that is a board that has both a diversity of talents and a diversity of perspectives. I think foundation boards I've been on, it's helpful to have people with a strong community perspective, an understanding of community activism, understanding of community needs. It's helpful to have people with a business perspective and an understanding of investments. Have people with, depending on the things your foundation is doing, it may be helpful to have people with a strong scientific perspective. The MacArthur Foundation almost always has had at least one Nobelist in the sciences on the board. I think the original board had 2 or 3. Obviously, the kinds of board members you have also has impact on what you do. The tools you have affect the problems you solve. So you construct a board around the kinds of problems you want to address.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. When you're considering going on a board or you're being recruited onto a board, the basic question you have to ask, are you aligned personally with the mission and the vision of the foundation? And that personal commitment around the priorities of the foundation, which will evolve over time because foundations aren't static, they're very responsive to the needs of the communities that they serve, I think is fundamental. And so as you think about all the things that Bob said, which are absolutely true, you want a group of people that both have the talents, the expertise, the commitment to the vision, but there are certain characteristics about being able to debate openly, being candid, working collaboratively with the CEO, understanding and valuing those differences among the board members. All that makes for a much richer experience around the board table. And I think the most important thing besides the diversity is a point that Bob made. You need to have people around the table that understand in their fashion, it may not be intimately, but understand the needs of the populations that you're serving. And bringing that perspective to the table, I think, helps you make just much better decisions.
So a foundation board is, from my perspective, not a lot different than most of other, certainly nonprofit boards and many corporate boards. The same types of working committees from the audit, finance, et cetera, as well as on the program side, at least with foundations that I've been involved in. I am a graduate of USC, so it's nice to be back here. I actually graduated from the what was the School of Public Administration, the pre-runner to the School of Public Policy. So I'm one of those people that have sort of, that went to school and did what I went to school to learn, which was being in the nonprofit sector. But I learned that you think it's wonderful to be on a foundation board, which it is, but it's really hard to be a thoughtful funder. And it does start in terms of the kinds of policies and the strategic direction that a foundation makes. You asked Jim about assessment. Both the Ford Foundation as well as the Kresge Foundation, we have used both BoardSource as well as the Center for Effective Philanthropy has tools to assess boards, and I think that's certainly been helpful in terms of continuing to look at as a learning foundations, how do we do a better job of being a good board, a thoughtful board, an effective board, and to get that kind of feedback both from within our own board members, but then how that compares to other foundations that are doing work in the same way.
Kerry?
Sure. And from a corporate perspective, because I think I'm the one corporate foundation on the panel today, I think foremost the corporate foundation board members typically work for the institution. They represent lines of business and in our case, a wide geography. We're now global. We're across the United States, but also now with Merrill Lynch in many countries across the globe. So that is the difference. There are folks that understand the strategy of the bank, and our foundation is an extension of that. And obviously, we work, through these board members of the foundation. We also look at local community needs. So we don't solely rely on the board to make some of the grant-making decisions. We look locally. We have leadership teams that are the eyes and ears of the communities we serve, so that's part of it. And on some of our signature programs, we invite outside people to come in to help us decision grants. Example would be our Builders Program and our Student Leaders Program. So as a corporate foundation, there is a board that handles the broad strategies of the foundation, governance issues, but we work across businesses and across geographies to make sure we're responsive.
So does it always run so smoothly? We have a couple of board chairs, Irene and Bob. What happens when there's sort of big disagreements around the board table? Do you have any strategies or stories that would help us understand how you come to a resolution so that there's some clarity about the direction of the foundation?
Well, I think with any board, there are going to be differences of opinion, and I think that's really valued. So I think, as Bob said, having the diversity of thought and experience is certainly something that I certainly value. I do think the role of the chair is to ensure that there is a strong working relationship among the board. And earlier, when I first joined the Kresge board, there was, I think, some really wide-ranging views about where the foundation was going, the leadership of the foundation, and oftentimes when boards work through those is when you're changing a CEO. And so you find in that process, and I was the chair of the Kresge board when we hired Rip Rapson, our current CEO, and was on the Ford board when we hired our current CEO as well. And so that's a time when there's a lot of intense conversations about what is it the board is looking for in terms of a leader, what is the relationship with the board that we're looking for with the CEO, and really what is the strategic directions that we see the foundation going in this next process. But it does take, I think, for all of you that certainly sit on boards, I feel that part of the role of the board chair is to make sure there's strong communications between board meetings and that the work of the CEO and the board is as cohesive as we can make it.
Bob, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. When there are significant disagreements among board members, I think it's helpful, particularly for the chair, to think about whether this is are the disagreements about a subject that really needs a decision, or is the disagreement about something where the decision can wait, where there's time. If it's the latter, usually you can build a consensus over time by talking it out. You don't have to be in a hurry. If it is the kind of thing where a decision is needed, then the chair needs part of the responsibility of the chair, I think, to push through to a decision. In doing that, though, I think it's helpful. It's been helpful to me to keep in mind something I learned from a friend, Peter Kaufman, whom some of you here would know. Peter says that if you have all the facts that can be obtained, most decisions make themselves. So oftentimes when there's a lot of disagreement, it's because people are confused about the information, or people have different pictures of the world in their minds. And if you can get everybody on the same page in terms of what the information is, what the facts are, people will usually coalesce.
Jim, can I just say,
Sure.
I think it's also, so one is when you're going through a CEO transition, and clearly that opens up opportunity to discuss things differently. But I also think that if foundations are are learning institutions, and I think most of them are. And if foundation trustees see themselves in that role of being curious, constantly learning, understanding the environment in which we're operating, gathering information directly from the field, and understanding how that dynamic might impact the overall strategy, not the mission or the vision, but the strategy by which we engage with the communities that we serve. I think those are also times when there can be tension around the table, because you're thinking about the ways that you used to provide grants and how you understood your grant making and how you did your due diligence, and now you're thinking about it in a very different way. And that shift in your grant making focus or style, I think, can also cause, some tension around the table. The thing that I've found that has been, and it kind of goes to what you were saying, Bob, if you're a learning organization, you take your time to better understand the facts. And you go out and you evaluate, you talk to your stakeholders, you understand what other trustees and other foundations are doing, and give it some time, especially because a shift as important as that really needs to be made deliberatively. And so I think the fact that foundations by their very nature are learning organizations, and trustees, you hope, by their very nature are also curious and are lifelong learners, those two things combined, I think, allow you to sort of work through those tensions when you base them on what the field is saying.
Okay, I'm going to sort of switch a little bit, but it sort of builds on some of the comments before. When you sort of study boards in general, it's really important to have a good working relationship between the board and the CEO. And others will say that the most important decision a board makes is the selection of a CEO. What's your sense of what makes for a good working relationship between the board and a CEO? And when you look to hire a new CEO because there's a vacancy, or you go to that decision about whether or not you should renew a CEO, what factors play into that decision? Irene?
I think part is having an open and having an open relationship with the CEO and the board, and being able to candidly talk about issues. I, as the chair, and both foundations have instituted a more formal assessment process of the CEO on an annual basis. It was more informal before, and so we're now using an assessment that it's the same firm that's doing it each year, so we can actually track the change in the responses. And that really provides a baseline for being able to have a candid conversation about where the board feels that there is work that needs to be done on the part of the CEO or the foundation as a whole. And so those are hard conversations to have. I mean, we've all been through performance appraisals. But I think it's really critical, and if someone knows that that's just part of the process, then it's a lot easier to address. But I think it is to have an ongoing, candid, and honest conversation between the board and the CEO, and often through the chair.
Kerry?
In terms of the corporate perspective, and we are a different animal, I think the president or CEO of a foundation working for a company has to understand the mission of the organization they represent, because it is an extension of the company. But more and more, we're not siloed. Philanthropy is not a siloed asset that we bring to the community. It works across a broader range of CSR assets. So it's how we lend in the community, how we bring our volunteers in, what we do about environmental sustainability, how we're building our business practices. So we look at it as a whole portfolio of things that we bring to the community. So as someone running a corporate foundation, you have to work across business lines. You have to integrate what you do. You have to make what we do relevant to the senior leaders in the company and the foot soldiers on the ground. So it's really a different kind of collaboration, because you're working to make impact in the community, but you want to maintain great relationships and make sure that our senior executives understand what we're trying to address and how that will healthy communities will help our business. So it's sort of circular in a corporate foundation.
I think in addition to the obvious things around, clearly you want to have the expectations understood up front. You want to have a performance evaluation system. You want to measure against those. And, you're both working at the strategic and the operational level. You're managing your staff. You're overseeing the program work of the foundation. The one thing that I have found most valuable, not most valuable, but that I think is an important ingredient, is both the reputation of the foundation among the grantees and the nonprofit sector. How are we perceived? Are we seen as a true partner? Is it difficult to do work with us? All of those things that come from your clients, basically, your customers, the people that you serve. And the other thing is among your peers, because at the end of the day, the foundation CEOs are a very small, relatively small group of people that have tremendous impact. And if foundations work collaboratively and are able to support each other strategically or through networks or understanding big issues and how do you collaborate to really have impact, I think those are the two pieces that typically don't get picked up in performance evaluations, which I would encourage us to think about ways in which we can really learn from our clients as well as our peers.
I think what I've cared about most when I've done searches for CEOs is someone who really cares about effectiveness, about the effectiveness of the foundation's programs. And what Monica was talking about is one way of looking at that, the way the foundation is perceived by grantees. I've always thought you need to be a little careful about that and want to push beyond what the officers of the grantee organizations think, because they can be happy just if you're a regular provider of funds and don't give them too much trouble. What I want a CEO to really care about is whether the people who are supposed to be benefiting from the program that grantee is running are benefiting, are getting the kinds of benefits that you expected to have. And the other thing I guess I've cared about a lot is someone with an open leadership style, someone who wants to be transparent, whose first reaction is to get information out to everyone who needs it in the organization, including, of course, the board, but also people within the staff who need the information. Someone who's not trying to hold all the information into themselves and keep things quiet and protect at all costs their reputation. And it's way better to get information out and deal with issues.
So I think the one thing that's certainly the unique part of being a foundation is that it grants money, it gives away money. And I think that in the relationship between the board and the CEO and between board members, that oftentimes where there are perhaps debates or discussions is about the grant making itself. And I think that certainly foundations have in place processes, most foundations, where there is a sort of an extra layer of a governance protection, so that if a board member is related to an organization that's being considered, that they're not directly involved in the discussion about that organization or that grant. But nonetheless, in terms of whether it's kind of a larger funding of a sector of the field, or even the CEO and the staff making funding decisions or recommendations, know that there are board members that have relationships with organizations. And so I think that is a kind of unique balance that's constantly being thought about. And early in my tenure with the Kresge Foundation, some of the debates between board members were about how much money should be put into the Detroit area versus how much money should be put nationally. And we had board members in Detroit who were very passionate, of course, about wanting funding in the Detroit region. And we had board members who were from around the country who felt that there needed to be a better balance between the amount of monies that were going as well as perhaps particular organizations. So I think that is one of those unique kinds of things that happen around a board table and between the CEO and staff and board members, that is a constant balance and being very mindful of ensuring that there is an arm's length review.
Okay.
And
Kerry?
yeah, I would add that probably one of the biggest tensions between board members that I've come up with is the sort of decision on how much money should be in innovative programs and how much money should be the backbone of communities. So where do we push the dial, and how do we allocate dollars to do so? Because there's a real need in the community that you want to respond to, but yet there are also cutting-edge ideas that are perhaps going to be better solutions. And there's a whole host of conversations out there around impact investing and what we mean by that, and what role we can play, how we can engage our customers who want to work with us on certain programs. So looking at the various models, there is tension among board members on how we should proceed and how we should invest.
That sort of is a good segue to the next topic I wanted to raise, and that is whether or not foundations are risk takers or are risk averse. There's a lot of rhetoric about, because of the more insular nature of foundations, they're sort of immune from markets unless their endowment starts to dip, but they're endowed. They don't really have to get votes. They don't have to sell products. So they're sort of in a unique position institutionally in society. And we always hear that foundations should be the risk takers in society. They should take the long view. From your experiences, how much risk are foundation boards willing to take? And there are different types of risks. There's obviously the risk in terms of investment decisions. There's reputational risk, and there's also programmatic risk in taking, some risks with certain programs that may or may not end up in the long run working. So how do boards deal with risk? Are there certain areas that they're more willing to tolerate risk or shy away, or is it different boards have different risk profiles maybe? Some of you have served on different boards, so you might have that perspective that not all the foundation boards have the same risk preferences.
There's certainly a fiduciary obligation to ensure the long-term viability of the foundation. And so in terms of financial risk, and going back to what Irene was saying, there are lots of mechanisms, policies, procedures, frameworks that ensure that the foundation is managing the finances for the long term. I think even within that, depending on the foundation, there's still some latitude. Does it have to be the 5%? Can it be more than 5%, depending on the circumstances? And I think foundations respond to that differently. The area where, and I think Kelly was talking about a little as well, there's a sort of a fundamental basic approach, I think, that certain foundations might take in terms of their grant making. But I go back to what I was saying about learning from that. And one of the things that I really, I think we can do more of is to take those learnings and understand, how do you impact systematically the nonprofit sector so that it can be more resilient, so it has more capacity, so it is able to sustain itself over the long term. And I'll just give you an example because Fred's here and because the Weingart Foundation is part of this. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was as we went through the economic crisis and we were making decisions about how much we were willing to invest, some of the things that we were learning from the sector clearly was that, sources of revenue were shrinking. There was a lot of pressure on the nonprofits. And so it actually changed the way in which we thought through our grant making fairly fundamentally. And not only was it that we were giving different kinds of grants, but it also led us to think more in terms of the resiliency of the nonprofit sector itself. And over the last 5 years, I think we've been more willing to think much differently, and in fact more strategically about what are the things that are critical for this sector to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive and to be as successful as it can be. So sometimes in a very difficult circumstance, you'll actually begin to, I think, take more risk because you understand that the circumstances in which you are operating have shifted fundamentally. And it requires you to be more innovative and to be a little bit more opportunistic.
And, from a corporate foundation standpoint, I totally agree. We kind of went through this whole process, I would say beginning in 2008 with the economic downturn and looking at, where we were as an financial institution. And one thing we did, we're a pass-through foundation, but we went out with a 10-year, a $2 billion philanthropic goal. And obviously Bank of America wasn't at its earning potential. And we knew that we had to be there for the community. So that was one thing we did. But the other thing we did was really looked at, what issues we should be most focused on. And we revamped our grant making on the most critical needs we saw in the communities across the country. And that was, hunger, housing, jobs, really providing that baseline safety net support in communities. So we were very nimble and very much, and the board was very much engaged in this discussion about how we could be a better partner in the community. And that really has, I think, has been very effective for us, not only in terms of our impact, but also in terms of helping us repair our brand, because that's part of what a corporate foundation does. It's an extension of the company. So it was a decision that we made in response to the needs of the community. And the other thing I would say is our board is very supportive of general operating support. In 2012, over 60% of our grants were general operating, which, when we talk about capacity, is one of the things that I think is most important to the sector. And for 10 years, and we have still maintained this, we have been very involved in leadership of nonprofits through a builders program and also the next generation of leaders. So I think the capacity piece is understood by our board and something that we will continue to do, and something that the board is clearly behind.
Yeah, I'd like to just address for a moment program risk, which is what most of us have been talking about. I think that's the more interesting question. Investment risk, you have to take a reasonable amount of if you're going to hit what is a pretty tough hurdle of 5% plus expenses plus inflation. That's not an easy hurdle to make, and you're not going to make that without taking some investment risk. And legal reputational risk, I think most foundations properly are pretty conservative about that and should be. Program risk, I think foundations, the limited universe I've seen, tend to be a little too conservative. There's certainly exceptions, but I think sometimes that is in significant part the responsibility of the board. That boards, if boards don't let foundation management know that they are tolerant to risk, that they're tolerant to failure, that they recognize that if we try some things that haven't been done before, if we fund some things that haven't been done before, and they don't work, well, that happens. If you're funding new things, some of them aren't going to work so well. Unless the board creates an environment in which it's safe to fail when you try new things, you're not going to have a lot of innovation. And so I think it's a unique contribution the board can make. As I said a while ago, there are exceptions to foundations being willing to take risks. I've just been on the Irvine Foundation board for a little while, but one of the things I really like about it is Irvine is funding a significant education change initiative that refers to as linked learning. Just trying educational change is risky. Most attempts at educational change have not worked very well. So if you're trying something like that, you're willing to take some risks, and the board has been quite encouraging of that risk taking.
I think another part of the program risk is the fact that we know there's a lot more scrutiny about what foundations are doing, what nonprofits are doing. Remember the days of the hearings on the Hill about how much were the CEOs being paid and how much were board members being paid and so forth. So I think we're in an age where there is a lot more potential for foundations to end up on the front page of a newspaper. And so that shouldn't mean that we don't do the kinds of program strategies. But I think that certainly at the Ford Foundation, for example, which has historically been sometimes a lightning rod for some of the programs and the things that they've funded globally, that it is a conversation that we have at the board level with the CEO and with the staff. There are some things that we strategically make a decision not to communicate externally in terms of programs that we do. And there are others that we feel that there's a role the foundation can play in advancing the work of a part of the sector or one of the fields that we're funding, that we can step out and say things that may be harder for grantees to say, particularly around issues that are going to potentially be much more controversial. But I think Bob's right. We were having a board retreat at the Kresge Foundation, and one of the topics was risk. So what is the level or the tolerance of risk that we feel that we ought to consider? And one of the things that we said to the staff, the senior staff, was that we really feel it's important that you feel that you can take some risks, that within the portfolio of things that you're funding, that not every grant is going to be the perfect grant, or it's not going to turn out the way that you hoped it would be, but that's okay if we can learn from it. And if you come back and say that this is what we learned, and so we're going to make an adjustment, or we're going to do something that's different, I do think that is a part of the work that foundations can do that perhaps other parts of our sector are not as well able to do.
Okay, I'm going to sort of switch gears, but it really follows upon that conversation. And that is, foundations are either always doing a new strategic plan or they don't change for decades. Or it's one or the other, and so people think. So how do you go about sort of steering the foundation in new directions? Are there certain opportunities that happen? Is it a CEO change? Is it sort of external environments? Are there new opportunities that happen, new issues that surface? Sort of, how does the board talk about sort of changing directions or sort of changing course slightly? Maybe that's partly risk, but it's largely, hopefully foundations aren't on autopilot. So how do you sort of, as a board, sort of talk about that? And then what's come up in several of the answers is give direction or make sure that the foundation staff understands sort of the leeway they have.
I think
Kerry?
I began answering a little bit about the environment. That is what is the imperative for us in terms of being responsive to community. And I think the other piece that sort of layers into this, we have many stakeholders in a corporate foundation. We have shareholders of the company who are interested in what we do. We have our customers. We have the communities in which we live and work who have needs. And we have lines of business that are intersecting. So, it's finding the right balance where we're responsive to the community and remain relevant. And I think across the board, I will say, with the shift that we made recently, we're ever more focused on low and moderate income communities. We're focused on basic needs, and there's a real, I think, strength of this is that employees are behind it, and in fact, we have programs where we'll match employee giving. In some ways, it is almost like its own impact investing. We'll encourage our customers to join us in a campaign around hunger. And over the last 3 years, we've given about $21 million in hunger, but in addition to some customer matching. So we're really trying to leverage the full franchise when we do something. So when we are innovative, we can sometimes look at ways to sensibly illuminate issues through a cause marketing effort that's really grounded in community support. But the board's got to really buy into that, and quite frankly, the piece that I think is most important is the fact that we have folks in communities who are the eyes and ears of their needs. So we really rely on these community assessments to help build our platform. It's an outside-in process.
So I think the board does play a key role, and that the importance of having the diversity of voices at a board table, and certainly a diversity from a broad range of perspectives, including the various program sectors. As many of you know, the Kresge Foundation used to fund probably 90% in building campaigns. And we have completely changed that course, and so maybe do 5% funding now for actual buildings. And that process began with a lot of questions the board was raising about the environment. What was changing? Is this something that we ought to continue to do to fund new buildings or to fund the renovation of buildings? And it continued on through the course of the change of our CEO, or bringing on a new CEO, and has now very dramatically gone to a very different portfolio. I think likewise, Ford used to fund based on program officers. So we funded, when I first joined the foundation, we had about maybe 250 areas that we were funding, and it was really hard as a board member even to really understand the full range of things that we were funding. We now fund in about 36 key areas, and so even that is a wide range of activities, but that kind of strategic shift in part I think is driven by conversations at the board table with the CEO. In part it's driven by external forces. And part it's driven by staff who are out in the field, who are constantly hearing from the organizations that they're working with about what are the real needs in the field.
I just think this last piece is so critical. You know, strategies don't have to shift every year. It is important for boards to go away and evaluate how they're doing against their strategic priorities, and I don't know how common it is across all boards, but certainly an annual retreat of some kind where you evaluate progress against that. But the way in which you go about meeting those objectives, those do change, and they should change based on the environment in which we operate. So I think, you know, shifting from capital to, you know, a different sort of program, or going from 250 to 36 and really focusing, I think those sorts of strategic directional changes come out of this, you know, constantly being in touch with the field. And one of the things that, you know, I don't know if we're going to get to this, Jim, later in terms of what would you change, but I think the ability for directors or trustees to constantly learn, to bring in people from the outside, to understand ways in which your conversation has shifted. And what is it that's important among foundations, among nonprofits? How do communities of need, you know, how have those needs changed? I just think it's really important not to shift constantly, but always keeping your ear to the ground and making sure that you have an environment by which we're becoming better informed, and then can help with the CEO and our senior staff perhaps chart a different course. I think it's just absolutely critical.
Bob, did you have anything you wanted to add on the strategic direction?
Yeah, I've never had much interest in strategic plans, and you know, if there's a strategic plan discussion, I try to have something else to be thinking about while it's going on. But I think I have a lot of interest in new ideas and in the process by which a board and a foundation develop new ideas. And I think it's instructive in your own worlds and your own foundations to think about, you know, what have been the sources of our best ideas, you know, where have our best ideas come from, and then, you know, try to learn from that, try to learn to replicate that, and thinking back at 12 years, I was served on the MacArthur board, and where the best ideas came from, it was a variety of places. One of the best ideas, in my view, is that MacArthur had while I was there is a program in digital media and learning. Quite innovative. It was cutting edge. Is still cutting edge. It was the product of a partnership between a staff member, a program officer, and a board member John Seeley Brown, who spent some time here at USC. And the staff member had children, I think, who were beginning to experiment around with a lot of digital media, and she got interested in what are they doing, how are kids using digital media, how can digital media be more effective to transform education. And she was coming off of an experience of running a more traditional school, whole system school change project that was a complete failure, and MacArthur had several prior failures in educational reform, and so I think it was appealing to her to think, this is a way to change the system from the inside instead of trying to impose change from the top, from school boards and school superintendents to change it from the ground up. With John Seeley Brown, she had someone who had deep understanding of the field and of what could be done and who to connect her with, and he did a lot to teach her. In doing this, he was quite sensitive to, this was all blessed by the president of the foundation. A board member to start taking on that role with a program officer without that kind of transparency to the management of the senior management of the foundation would have a lot of, could bear the seeds of its own failure. But it was instructive how that succeeded. Some of the other best ideas, a couple came from board members in sessions that we had where we would spend half a day or so talking about what the big problems were that we had an ability to address, and then not trying to define them in great precision, but then bringing the foundation staff into the project of working with some of what we thought that were the best ideas and seeing if coming back in 3 months or 6 months to discuss whether there's something that concrete that we really could do.
Okay, I have like one more question, and then we're going to open up the mics for if you have questions, so you can be thinking about them. It's a great opportunity to ask these people that lead and govern some significant foundations. And that is, and Monica alluded to it, what would you change? What frustrates you? What would you do differently if you could as a foundation trustee? Go ahead, Kerry.
I'll go as the lone corporate voice. But the piece that I think our foundation board could do better, and the foundation itself, is think about collaboration differently. I think sometimes as a corporate player, you want to brand it, own it, run it, and that always isn't the best impact. And more, we're becoming a collaborator, working across with other foundations, with other corporations, with other kinds of organizations that really bring thought leadership into our foundation. So I think the whole idea of corporations being more collaborative is an important piece that I really bring, to the discussion at board meetings. And honestly, I think if you look at the issues and you look at some of the creative solutions, it is about collaboration. I mean, the White House has been engaged with social innovation. We've got all of these ideas out there, and it's not about your program, it's about the health of a community. And I think if we can get people to think that way on our board, the more impact we'll have.
I think that's very good, and one of the things that I had been thinking about, and very well put. And this isn't anything that frustrates me around the board table, but I think Bob actually alluded to it. I would like to better understand how innovation is driving changes within the sector. And at least in my industry, what I get paid to do, there's so much transformation around technology and communication and how that is changing both behaviors but also outputs. And I don't hear enough of that conversation around sort of innovation, technology, communication tools, and how that moves the needle, and if it can move the needle within the sectors that we serve. And, I think maybe that goes back to the risk-taking conversation. Maybe it also goes to, sort of how we're organized and what kind of staff we have. But I really think that there's something that needs to get fast-forwarded and accelerated around it, and think that you all can help us think differently about how we do our business when we think about the new tools that are available to us and bring those forward.
I would say that one of the challenges that we have is really being able to articulate what is the value that the sector brings to society. And I think, Jim, in your opening remarks, you said that most people don't understand foundations, which I think is true. And being in Washington and really sort of seeing the debate that's going on now in terms of what is the role of government, what is the role of the independent sector. I think we have to do a better job, and I think foundations need to play a role within that, either through funding or through partnerships, is really having the public better understand what it is that our sector does, the value that we bring. There's no way that we can replace what government needs to fund. We just don't have the resources, and people think we have a lot of money, but when you compare it to what the public sector needs to do, so some of those really tough questions, I think, is a part of the conversations that we're going to have to continue to have going forward. And as the debate around the charitable deduction and so forth continues on, I think we're going to have to find ways to come together and speak more as a unified voice. So the kind of the role of organizations that do advocate, whether it's Council on Foundations and the other organizations that speak for the sector, is something that we're going to have to make sure is as strong as that they can be.
I'd like to see foundations and foundation boards have more of a sense of impatience. I think Monica was referring to that a little bit. I think sometimes the perpetual nature of most foundations, a lot of foundations have chosen to be perpetual, they don't really have to be, but perpetual nature of most foundations has sometimes encouraged an excess of patience. And I think I'd like to see boards have a sense of, and managements of foundations have a sense of impatience with the problems they're addressing, and look for and try to approach problems with a sense that we want to put ourselves out of this business. We want to get the problem addressed and really get ourselves out of this business and to something else. And also a sense that foundations have a great responsibility. Foundations get an incredible tax benefit from society. And the only justification for that benefit, I think, socially, is if foundations can spend the money better than the government can spend it. And unless you think government spends money incredibly badly, that's a reasonable hurdle. And I don't. I think government spends money most of the time reasonably well. So I think that's a real hurdle. And foundations need to be accountable to that hurdle, and it's really only boards that can hold them accountable to that hurdle.
That's well said. And with that, let me see if anybody has a question for our panel. Yeah. Just come to a microphone. Identify yourself and your organization would be helpful.
Hello.
Yep.
Working? I'm Ed Skloot. I'm at Duke University and used to run the Surdna Foundation. I wanted to push a question of risk and link it to politics. What we have seen in the last 5 years, give or take, is increasing involvement by foundations in the political scene. If you took higher education or lower education, you could look at Gates, you could look at Lumina, you could look at Broad, you could look at Walmart and the Walmart and the family itself, doing enormous amount of work very heavily in the political world. Irene with Kresge, Kresge's done spectacular work in Detroit, is continuing to do it, but at the same time is going directly into the political world and doing things that could not have been imagined a few years ago. So you've been talking about risk, and I would say that there's a small trend, but it's a continuing one, in growing the engagement of philanthropy into the world of politics in virtually every field. So you are members of boards of trustees. I'm certain that the ones I've mentioned, they all thought their work has been appropriate. Where do you guys draw the line? Have you had experiences or questions where engaging politically has come up and you have had to take a stand, yes, no, or finesse it some other way?
Well, I would say that there is much more collaboration with the public sector, and you see a lot of that. Jim just did a report. I was telling him I thought he did a great job about the public-private partnerships. So I guess I would draw the line, and maybe not say political, but we certainly, there is a lot more work, which I think is a good thing, that foundations are doing to engage with agencies, cities, et cetera, in order to kind of move forward and address these big issues. So a city like Detroit has huge needs. And I think there's been a role that foundations have been able to play in partnership with local government, state government, and so forth. I think as a foundation, we are mindful of making sure that program officers understand the kind of fine line as they work with public sector. So there's a lot of training that we have asked to be done with program officers to ensure that they're not in the political realm and that they sort of steer a path that is appropriate as we are a 501c3, so or a foundation. So I think that, but that is going to be an ongoing challenge, and one that I certainly at the foundation board table, there is conversations with how do we continue to be advocates in the most appropriate way, either in partnership with grantees or the work that staff is doing within partnerships with public sector.
I'll give an example of something that MacArthur funded that was in a very intensely political area, but funded it in a way that was completely evidence-based and didn't try to make value judgments for people. It was on the topic of the U.S. fiscal future, and it funded a study by the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Political Administration of what the fiscal future looked like, and with 3 alternative paths to a sustainable fiscal future. One alternative path, and so it was deeply evidence-based with the best economic information, best demographic forecasting information about what the fiscal future looks like, and then it took one approach of what a high tax approach would look like, what a low spending approach would look like, and it's something that mixed taxes and spending changes. It became the board was nervous about this project all the way through, was nervous about how much to use the publicity powers of MacArthur to publicize it when it was done, and made judgments at each step of the way about that. When you turn something over to the National Academy of Sciences, you don't direct how they do it. They do it. And that, in an area like this, may have been a virtue. But it became the basis for Simpson Bowles. It's the basis underlying a lot of to the extent that the real debate, the debate by people who are trying to solve the problem, is largely grounded on that work.
And I think that is a really interesting question because I'm going to take it to a pragmatic level. And one of the things that we all know, the deficit is not going away. And there's not enough government funds to cover the issues out there. And we know that foundations can't cover that whole. So I think it gets back to collaboration and looking at a new frontier and how you partner. And I think you do have to be careful. There's a difference in my mind in working with state and local governments to problem solve as opposed to becoming political. And I think we as foundation people can understand that distinction. There's a line you don't cross, but there's a way to help solve problems. And I know I brought this up earlier, but yesterday there was a discussion at California grantmakers around impact investing, and that those public-private partnerships are bringing in government. And I think that there's a shift in how we try to solve particularly safety net issues. So I don't have the answer, but I know it's on our mind, and if as the field grows and becomes more, I guess, conversant and we're all engaged in it, I think it will change how we connect with government in terms of helping solve problems. But I think there is a difference between that and really the political arena.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Wendy?
Wendy Guerin,
You're it.
Parsons Foundation. I think you had consensus that one of the most important things you do is select your CEO and evaluate and guide that person. But we might also agree that the second most important thing would be your own governance. And how do you select new trustees? How do you incorporate them to develop the cohesiveness you need as a board? And the sort of a corollary question is, what do you think about board members who serve at multiple organizations, and what are the advantages of board members that serve more than one foundation with different roles? So I'd be interested in your perspectives on that really core governance issue.
Who wants
Well, I
to
think
start?
you're right, Wendy, that the other part of the important role that trustees play is the selection of other trustees, new trustees. And that's probably one of those things that people find is a secret, like so what really goes on around the board table of a foundation. Some foundations use search firms, others do not. I think as someone who's had the benefit and the honor of serving on two foundations, I bring learning back and forth. I think, and I'm a big advocate of, as some people in this room know, about the diversity on boards, certainly from not only the gender and the ethnicity, but the geography. So, the West Coast or west of the Mississippi is really not on national boards represented the way that it should. So that's the other thing. And so I think once we can begin to change or to diversify the composition of boards, then it'll continue to change. And so I think certainly it's great that Monica has gone on to the Rockefeller Foundation board. We just need a lot more diverse voices, and so I feel that there's a responsibility on the part of those of us that do sit on boards that do feel that it's important that we have a diverse set of voices around the table, that we become the biggest advocates to make sure that happens.
Anybody else want to respond?
That's good.
We're good? Okay, well, just on time, let's thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts. We'll be back in the room for lunch and a panel of local leaders.